Okay, so finally we come to the last game on our list, Away, a survival series. This game was kinda rough for me, but let's take a look at the trailer to give you a brief first impression and then I'll share my thoughts.
This is the story of a young sugar glider. Whose journey into the wild has only just begun. This is a story of adventure. A story of discovery. A story of survival. This is the story of the life that remains. This is your story. Welcome to the Animal Kingdom.
My first impression of Away, before even playing the game, was one of intrigue. I really liked the concept of the game and the hyper-realistic style that made it look like a nature documentary. There's a certain allure to the first 20 minutes or so as the narrator talks you through the lives of a young sugar glider and his family venturing through a violent storm. But as that initial interest wore away, I became more and more frustrated with the game's unpolished animations, unintuitive controls, repetitive nature, and arduously shallow gameplay, all of which make the game a challenge to get through for all the wrong reasons. If you've ever watched Planet Earth or Blue Planet on BBC, you'll instantly feel a sense of familiarity with the game's tone. The narration over gameplay is an interesting and undoubtedly unique take on the animal simulation subgenre. Each challenge that our protagonist faces is narrated with equal parts drama and information. It's only towards its climax that the game starts to think of itself less as a nature documentary and more as an Uncharted game. Moments involving blazing infernos and high-speed deer chases, which, while fun, do offset that balance somewhat. Those moments are also unfortunately hampered by a steady lack of polish. Everything from animations not loading to infuriatingly unintuitive traversal mechanics make for a tedious slog through a surprisingly bland-looking forest environment. The game does enough to keep you engaged through its visuals, but most of the areas tend to blend together. Forest areas are what you'll be seeing for all of what the developer Breaking Walls says is an 8 to 10 hour experience, but in reality the game's main narrative takes up half of that. If we're being generous, the rest of the game's runtime is occupied by a handful of side activities that range from eating mushrooms to chasing dragonflies, none of which provide much substance at all. You might assume that the gameplay would glide in and be Away's saving grace, but unfortunately, the moment-to-moment experience leaves a lot to be desired. Platforming is obviously the main element here, with the playable character being a sprightly young sugar glider, and there is some fun to be had in traversing the expansive forest map. The novelty of being able to navigate through the air makes for some light enjoyment, but after the first few hours the magic is gone, and what you're left with is a clunky platforming experience that feels as shallow and disappointing as every other aspect of the game, not least of which is the combat. Over the course of the story, you'll encounter everything from rats to snakes and large overbearing spiders, but the lack of feedback and the disappointingly simple attack and dodge mechanics are sure to be more successful at giving you the heebie-jeebies than any arachnids. When you aren't contending with poorly executed quick-time events, combat reverts to button mashing, which is ultimately unsatisfying, much like the activating mushrooms to top up your health, which also suffers from some unfortunately stiff animations. And as we go through the checklist of game mechanics on display, the next contender to fall short is the linear structure of the game's narrative path itself. On more than one occasion, I found myself becoming lost at the hands of Away's poorly designed levels, which tried to have you follow a predetermined path. While that in itself is absolutely serviceable game design, the fact is that the game often does a poor job at communicating where it expects you to go. Once you figure out that there are glowing mushrooms placed on the ground to guide you, the experience will come much easier. But the truth is, I didn't realize that's what they were there for until very late into the experience, simply because they're placed so abundantly that they seem to be just another part of the environment. Perhaps the game's exploration mode is the answer? This mode scraps the story element entirely and allows you to roam the world as a floating blue orb possessing any animal or insect you choose. It's definitely a fun idea and a nice addition, but once again it falls short of adding any real substance to the experience. Sure, the creatures all operate differently, if you can actually find any, but there doesn't appear to be anything to do here beyond general exploration. It was also rife with bugs at the time of writing, though Breaking Walls did promise to have that fixed in a day 1 patch. So as for my rating of this game, I'm going to give the story a 2 out of 5 and the gameplay a 1 out of 5, for a total of 3 out of 10. I know it's a low rating, but as a whole, Away was an interesting idea for a game, squandered by a lack of any real value and polish. You get the experience of participating in one of those many nature documentaries you've seen on Netflix, but beyond that, there's nothing here that isn't being done far better elsewhere. If you want to play the game for yourself and form your own opinion, it's available on PS4, PS5, Xbox, and Steam. And let me know in the comments if I was too harsh on this one. I'd love to hear your thoughts.